Hi, I'm Matt Bauman, and I'm a land use planner with the Minnesota DNR. Today, I'll be sharing some of the unique land use standards for the Lower St. Croix Riverway. The intended audience for this presentation is local officials. Each of them, representing each community in the Riverway, is responsible for administering land use ordinances within the Riverway. Though the DNR has a role in management, we don't have any permitting authority for activities above the water's edge. We might comment on or even challenge a decision from time to time, but really our authority to do so is no different than any other concerned citizen. Now, we'll always maintain a strong interest in the Riverway. It's perhaps one of the best assets we have in Minnesota, and we want it to be a resource. Our goal for this presentation is primarily to help generate continued support and improvement for Riverway management. This presentation is going to provide a broad overview of Riverway regulations. I'll start with history and give a background of the management structure, very broad overview there. And then I'm going to dig into the land use and zoning controls that we have that are detailed in rule and implemented through local government ordinances, zoning ordinances. There's a whole host of different sticky issues that I'm going to dig into. And this is really where local governments can address gaps in our state rules. And it's hard to motivate local communities to do that without being very realistic about some of the shortcomings in rule. There's tons of opportunities for higher standards for local governments to take advantage of. And each of those higher standards, recommended higher standards, I've identified in yellow throughout the latter half of this presentation. Permitting, administration, these innovative standards, they might be the most effective tools we have to preserve the character of the Riverway. And there's just so many opportunities for local governments to better manage development. But it's important for local governments to embrace the tool that is permitting. And we hope that this presentation can help highlight that better. St. Croix is a special place, and it deserves unique protections, different from other water bodies, different than just the statewide shoreland protections. Now, I lived in the valley for a short period of time when I first moved to the metro. I fell in love with it then, and I continue to fish it and explore it as often as I can. The river is a gem, and everyone I've met in the area feels the same way. It's beautiful, it's a fantastic fishery, and it might be the most species-rich water body in the upper Mississippi River Basin. There's just an unbelievable amount of biodiversity. 111 fish species have been documented in the river, which is remarkable. And 41 mussel species have been documented. Now, mussels are considered to be, they're actually an indicator species for clean water. And this river might have more mussels than anywhere else in the country, maybe beyond. But it's under threat. There's a ton of development throughout the watershed. That's leading to runoff, harmful algal blooms, phosphorus loading. All that is threatening both the character of the water body as well as the water quality. Now, land use regulations, what we're focusing on in this presentation, are a very difficult thing to generate support for. I encourage everyone with an interest in the river to stay engaged with their community, Wild Rivers Conservancy, and support your riverway protections. It's just so important for residents to keep up with local decision making. They can check agendas, they can speak up at city and county hearings to support the implementation of reasonable riverway standards. I'm going to start by giving a historical context, and I'll try to be brief with this, but it's important to have this historical context to understand why these regulations exist. So it began before 1968, but 1968 was the year where the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act was passed and it was established. There was a lot of momentum leading up to it. Much of it was driven by Senators Walter Mondale from Minnesota, Gaylord Nelson from Wisconsin. Locally we had the coal-fired King plant was under construction in Oak Park Heights. There's this huge high-rise that was proposed in Hudson. All of this was kind of helping to drive support locally for wild and scenic river standards. Dam construction was kind of out of control by this time from the federal government. So original passage in 1968 included Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. It included the Upper Riverway, but the Lower Riverway wasn't yet ready for designation, and it was left out. At the same time, Northern States Power was actually a significant reason that the Lower Riverway is protected the way it is today. They actually donated 25,000 acres, but under the agreement and understanding that it will be protected and managed in perpetuity. Those 25,000 acres, most of it's in the Upper Riverway. I think U.S. government received like 7,000 acres. Minnesota received 13,000 acres. Wisconsin received 5,000 acres. Within the Lower Riverway, those donations make up what is now interstate state parks, both on the Wisconsin and the Minnesota side. 1972, that act was amended to incorporate the Lower Riverway. It was recognized to keep the area in a pristine and natural state. Protections couldn't come exclusively from, the purchase of lands or scenic easements like the Upper Riverway and really all of the other federally designated rivers that had been established. Parts of it were just simply too developed. Instead, protections had to come from zoning regulations, which, this required a cooperative management approach, which is something that had never been implemented on any other wild and scenic river. So, after the legislation was put in place, a cooperative agreement was established, between Minnesota DNR, Wisconsin DNR, National Park Service to guide riverway management. And this founded the Lower St. Croix Management Commission, which at the time was staffed, and it remains, and it's a policymaking board that consists of representatives from each of these agencies. After passage, it took some time for the master plan and our own state rules to be developed. We put in some interim regulations, and then eventually we passed the rules. Now, those were in place for quite some time, and in the 90s, there was support for amending riverway regulations, but these required updates to the master plan first. This was a very time-intensive process, and it eventually culminated in the development of the 2001 Cooperative Management Plan, which was an update to the master plan. Now, it was always intended for the states to update their rules following the adoption of the Cooperative Management Plan. Wisconsin was successful in their rule update. Minnesota, unfortunately, we didn't get to the finish line and the effort fizzled out. And I share this background in particular because it's important to recognize that the state rules that we have today are the same rules that we had 50 years ago. They are what we have, and they're imperfect. And I say this because it's important for local governments to recognize how they can address some of these shortcomings of the rules and be proactive and adopt innovative standards, ordinance provisions that better protect the riverway. And add clarity. There's some gray area in our rules, and I'll be the first to admit that. And as I shared earlier, we'll touch on a few suggestions for local governments. Here we'll shift to management of the riverway. There's a few different management strategies for the riverway. Under land zoning management, I've detailed the ownership of land and easements. Now, what's the best way to control what happens on a piece of ground? You buy it. The National Park Service, they purchased a lot of land after designation. Now, much of which were in the form of scenic easements. That's land that you can see from the river. Zoning ordinances, riverway ordinances, they apply throughout the riverway from Taylor's Falls to the confluence of the Mississippi. There's also rules for surface water use. Boat type, like boat type would include, we have a limitation on jet skis in certain parts of the river. Boat speeds, a number of areas are slow speed only. And we've also got limitations on marinas too. Now, each of these strategies, they play an important part of management of the riverway. But this presentation is just going to focus on zoning specifically. I touched on the Management Commission earlier. This is a policy-making body, which is made up of 3 voting members: Wisconsin DNR, Minnesota DNR, National Park Service. And since 2001, the partnership team, the Lower St. Croix River Partnership Team, has also had a representative on the commission, but they're kind of in a more non-voting capacity. They bring recommendations to the commission. The commission meets every couple years or so. Maybe some years it might be more frequently. I do know the Upper St. Croix also has a separate management commission, but I think they even meet more infrequently than the Lower St. Croix. Now, the partnership team is an extension of the management commission. They review developments in the riverway and other current riverway issues, and they report their findings and provide recommendations to the management commission. They meet the 5th Tuesday of every month, I guess, when there is a 5th Tuesday. There's a lot of opportunity for the partnership team, and I encourage any kind of riverway advocates to stay involved there. The different management zones. The master plan had identified a federal zone and a state management zone. There's slight differences to how these areas are managed. The National Park Service's management efforts within the Lower Riverway are focused almost entirely within the federal zone. When designated, it was understood that the best method of preserving the riverway would be outright purchase of lands and scenic easements. Really, there was only so much money to go around. So the upper 27 miles, basically everything north of Stillwater, is the area where the National Park Service, they concentrated their acquisitions. A handful of lands, mostly islands, were purchased outright, but most of the acquisitions were scenic easements. The National Park Service has a web mapper that's available online, which details the parcels with ownership interest that they have. All other protections in the Lower Riverway come in the form of local land use and zoning regulations. But the federal zone north of Stillwater has this extra layer of protection. Let's get into zoning controls. In Minnesota, along the Riverway, we have 13 local governments that have zoning authority. 11 of these 13 are in Washington County. I've included this note about how many communities have an ordinance based off of Washington counties because they all have similar ordinance provisions, which vary from state rules in quite a few areas. Washington County used to serve as zoning administrator for 8 of these communities, and these ordinances have stayed very similar ever since. Now, this is an important note because the standards in an ordinance are the controlling law. But for the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to speak to the regulations as they were written in rule. But I'll do my best to identify areas where there's variation. While there's water quality components to the program, the regulations are primarily designed to maintain the scenic and natural character of the river. I'll get into each of these more, but the big ones are districts, which determine the intensity of development that's allowed. This allows greater density within city limits. Dimensional standards such as lot size, lot width, setbacks, height, impervious surface, land uses, with the exception of urban areas and the occasional marina, land uses are largely restricted to single-family homes throughout the riverway. Color of structures, and a big one is limitations on vegetation cutting and land alterations. To determine if you're in or outside of the riverway boundary, there's two sources that I want to call attention to. The first is our GIS data set for GIS users, which is available on Minnesota Geospatial Commons. That will also include data on districts. So it would show you spatially where the urban district is versus the rural district. On a screen right now, you can see a clipping from our DNR shoreland classification and special water body designations mapper. That map is only going to show the boundaries, what's in or out of the Riverway district. It's not going to detail what those districts are. But if you just want to determine whether you're in or out of the Riverway boundary, this is a good resource for you, and it's very user-friendly. There are two districts in the Riverway, rural and urban. These districts are described in rule, and they influence minimum lot sizes, lot widths, setbacks. Urban districts are further broken down by sewered and unsewered. You know, and that's based on as those sewers existed when the interim regulations were first put into place in 1974. To the best of my knowledge, I think Stillwater, Oak Park Heights, and Bayport are the only cities which have a sewered district. But really, it's probably even a moot point because almost all of these areas are completely developed without any more opportunities for subdivisions. So for the most part, all sewered areas are already platted. There's really no opportunity for creation of new lots, as best I can tell. You know, by and large, the rural and urban districts are based on the city boundaries as they existed in 1974. You know, except for a few parts of Afton, Marine on St. Croix, Taylor's Falls, I think that there were a handful of rural districts within those cities. Scandia is a city that exists today. It didn't exist in 1974. And as such, the entire city of Scandia is considered rural, you know, since it was incorporated after the rules took effect. This program is kind of strict when it comes to land usage. In 1974, it was recognized that development from the metro, it was inevitable. And the use standards and rule are designed to preserve, you know, that rural character that existed at the time of designation. I think everybody that lives in the valley, they recognize that rural character and they like it and they want to keep it. And these rules help to protect that. You know, by and large, the Riverway is 90% single family housing. And there's opportunity for basic accessory uses, you know, parking or home-based businesses, as well as accessory structures, you know, like a shed or a pool. You know, but really those accessory structures have to meet the same setback requirements as any other primary structure does too. Commercial uses are allowed, but they're largely limited to urban areas. This program specifically prohibits multifamily residential uses, but there's also special accommodations for, you know, cities that had previously allowed a use prior to 1974. At the time, they wanted to preserve those historic uses. So, you know, if a community had historically allowed some uses, those were essentially grandfathered for a handful of cities. So Though multifamily is prohibited, there's a few communities that can still permit it. This table, along with the next slide, it comes from Wild River Conservancy's. They have a document that's called the Landowner's Guide to the Lower St. Croix Riverway. This table gets into some detail on the dimensional standards, allowable dimensional standards in the riverway. It's showing standards for lot size, lot width, building setback from the ordinary high water level, setback from a bluff line. And in the bottom two rows, really across the board, the riverway has a 35-foot height standard, as well as a 20% limit for impervious surface coverage on any given lot. Structure setbacks apply to all structures, whether it's a house or a shed. Everywhere else in the state, we have the shoreland program, which allows small sheds near shore. And these types of exceptions aren't allowed in the riverway. All structures are treated the same. There's a couple of exceptions to these structure setbacks. Stairways are allowed, and there's also a setback averaging provision when neighboring lots are closer to the water. Pretty straightforward there. Oh, there's the exceptions. The state rules, they refer to structure setbacks. Like I said, the structure definition, it clarifies that this not only applies to the building itself, but appurtenances as well. Now, if you look in your ordinance, appurtenances is also defined, but it's in rule, it's defined kind of broadly. The definition provides examples such as garages or decks, but it doesn't, I guess it doesn't explicitly mention massive water slides, for instance, but really any reasonable zoning administrator should be subjecting a structure such as this to setback requirements. So appurtenances would certainly include garages or decks. Bluff lines and slopes. So this the rules regulate development on slopes greater than 12%. Structures shall not be placed on slopes greater than 12%, except for stairways and lifts. 12% is a strict standard. It's not steep at all. The standard has some basis in erosion prevention. Some people see the word bluff and they imagine, a very steep slope. 12% is not steep. There's actually a few places in rules that it refers to it as a bluff line. In most cases, it's just slope over 12%. Yeah, there's some basis in erosion prevention, but the primary goal of this standard is to protect the views. Simply put, houses on hills, they're just more visible than houses that aren't. The bluff line is a point where a slope, it goes from greater than to less than 12%. And, so as you're starting low on a slope and it's steeper, and then it starts to level out. Once it levels out to less than 12%, that's what they consider the bluff line. And your setback is established beyond that line. Now this bluff line definition, it's an imperfect definition since it doesn't really specify a set horizontal or vertical distance for which we measure rise over run. One consideration for local governments is the cooperative management plan. It offered an alternative variation of this definition, which for any interested community, we'd find that acceptable. And if a community wanted to adopt it as part of an ordinance amendment process, we would certainly help them through that. Structure height is regulated in the riverway throughout. We have a maximum 35 feet height limit, and that's measured as 35 feet above the average ground level at the building line. Now, I can't tell exactly how tall this house is, but it appears to be over 35 feet. And really, if this house was built on or expanded after 1974, then, I mean, put plainly, it just simply shouldn't have been allowed. Paint color isn't something that most zoning administrators are used to regulating, but you know, there's requirements for the riverway for earth tone colors. Earth tone is used in rule, and as I mentioned, Wild Rivers Conservancy, they got a number of great resources. They put together some earth tone color swatches, like paint swatches from a store, which can be treated as you know, pre-approved colors. And to some extent, I think this takes the guesswork out of it. Okay, sticky issues. Jurisdiction. The ordinary high water level. It serves as the jurisdictional boundary between local government zoning and the DNR's authority to administer and enforce states' public water rules. This is also the point at which setbacks are measured from, you know, setback from the ordinary high water level. In the riverway, ordinary high water level, it has some quirks. From Stillwater south, the water surface is largely flat, you know, and that's because the ordinary high water level is influenced by the backwater effects of the Mississippi. So, from Stillwater south, the ordinary high water level is a specific number, elevation, relative to sea level. For areas upstream of Stillwater, that line is the top of bank. Now in 2004, the elevation from Stillwater and south, the ordinary high water level elevation from Stillwater south was officially increased by 5 feet. You know, it went from 675 feet to 680. That's based on the Stillwater gauge. The old number was way too low. And when they changed it at the time, there was significant discussion and concerns that it would create substandard structures due to this change. And this would impact setbacks in particular. So a decision was made to continue using the original ordinary high water level number for setbacks in particular. But for public waters purposes, you know, permitted activities, that jurisdictional boundary was changed to the 680 number. And here's a clip from the Stillwater gauge, and you can see in this screen the last 10 years of the Stillwater gauge. You can see that the water level is consistently above 675 feet number. So if you want to know where to measure setbacks from when south of Stillwater, it's fairly consistent with those very low water levels. Impervious surface is fairly straightforward, 20% lot coverage, and impervious surface is not defined. We suggest local communities define that in their ordinance. In our shoreland model ordinance, we have a good recommended definition that communities can consider. A lot of people think that impervious surface standard is just for stormwater and runoff, to limit runoff to the water body. Well, yeah, that is a goal of this standard. It's also the primary tool that we have to prevent small lots from getting overdeveloped. You know, if you have a tiny, tiny lot, this standard limits a development to 20%. That keeps huge structures from getting developed on tiny lots. You know, if somebody wants to build a huge house, they should buy a parcel that can accommodate for it. You know, all too often we see these huge houses getting squeezed into these small, tiny lots, and it's just not sustainable. And the market's driving development to houses bigger than ever before. And when these activities occur on small lots, there's just a ton of constraints, and it's just not expansions, but it's also tear downs and rebuilds. And in most cases, this is going to trigger standards for substandard lots and substandard structures. Since so much of the developed parts of the riverway were platted before the rules were ever put in place, they don't meet the dimensional standards under our riverway rules. So in our wild and scenic rivers, the rules have special standards for these situations that differ from anywhere else in the state. Within the riverway, we have standards for substandard lots and substandard structures. Everywhere else in the state would follow the statutory guidance for nonconformities, and it's different. We have a lot of smaller riparian lots, specifically between, about Stillwater and down to Afton State Park. There's others out there, but that whole stretch there is all small lots for the most part. And a lot of these were subdivided before the rules were put in place, and they don't meet the minimum lot sizes or lot width standards. Now, the rules have language for substandard lots that details when these lots are considered buildable. Now, the rules detail when these lots are considered buildable. But our interpretation is that this also applies to expansions. And I'll expand on this a bit. But number one, it must be able to accommodate a legal septic system. It must have been in separate ownership from adjoining lots. And this third one is an important one. The rules give local governments the freedom to set a more flexible minimum lot size criteria in their ordinance. This was designed to accommodate for those communities that were already fully subdivided with small substandard lots. Most riverway ordinances, they follow the lead of Washington County and set this threshold at 60% of what is required by rule. But theoretically, a city with many small lots could reduce this number, and that would give them a little bit more freedom, but they would still be limited by the 20% impervious surface limit. So, it won't get them off the hook completely, but it will at least reduce the number of variances that they might have to process. Let's go through an example. We have a homeowner that's proposing an expansion on a 25,000 square foot lot. They're in an urban unsewered district, and there we have a minimum lot size of 1 acre. Now, our ordinance, like a lot of ordinances in the riverway, they've set a threshold of 60%. So building and expansions are only allowed on substandard lots if the lot is at least 60% of the minimum lot size. So 60% of 1 acre, 1 acre is 43,560 square feet. 60% of that is 26,136 square feet, which is larger than this lot in this case. So this lot's too small. All too often, we encounter landowners who bought a lot that is too small to build what they want to build. And they get stuck on a certain design, or they get stuck on a vision of what they want their house to be, and they're willing to test the limits of what a community is willing to approve. So they have to pursue a variance, and that is problematic because variances should be rare, and a community should be very reluctant to approve them. If you're following the statutory criteria for approving a variance, it must always involve a unique lot with significant constraints, something beyond just a design preference. A small lot is not a unique lot. Small lots are incredibly common in a shoreline situation. It's got to be unique in a variety of different ways. If a community is truly following the statutory criteria, variances would just be so much more rare. But if for whatever reason a community determines that this expansion meets the statutory criteria, They should also be imposing some sort of mitigating conditions to the approval. Vegetation restoration is a big one, which we promote in almost any kind of variance in a shoreline situation. They might say, we'll approve a variance, but you got to install a vegetative buffer and screening to mitigate the impacts of your development. You know, and it's not just the impacts to the river user, but it's also neighbors too. Let's check out another example. Here, this landowner is proposing a redevelopment on a 15,000 square foot lot. This is an urban sewer district, and the minimum lot size here is a little smaller than elsewhere. It's 20,000 square feet. Like the last example, our ordinance in this case only allows building and expansions if the substandard lots are at least 60% of the minimum lot size. 60% is the threshold that the community chose to enforce. So 60% of 20,000 square feet is 12,000 square feet. In this case, this lot is big enough to accommodate a redevelopment. For these small lots, it's really important to also be evaluating impervious surfaces. In the case of this small lot, impervious surfaces cannot exceed 2,400 square feet. 20% of 15,000 is 2,400 square feet. Impervious surfaces beyond 20% would only be allowed with a variance. And I mean, really, I hate even discussing variances as a viable option. Zoning administrators shouldn't let it get to the point of a variance application. They should be proactively working with homeowners on the front end of a project when they're encountering lot constraints and really clarify the expectations of the property owner on the front end. These types of developments might be common on Lake Minnetonka, but they're not consistent with the goals of the Lower Riverway. The full disclosure, I don't know the background on these developments, but they appear to be newer houses built after 1974. They don't appear to meet setback requirements, and they also aren't screened. And we all know there's demand for homes these size, but far too often we see them proposed on lots that were just not platted to accommodate anything larger than a small cabin. We see landowners continuously trying to push the bar and develop these lots as intensively as possible. A lot of people want to locate on the Riverway, and there's incredible demand. And it's important that homeowners recognize their expectations and what is approvable. There's nothing in rules limiting home size, but the lot needs to be large enough to meet the impervious surface requirements, and it needs to be screened, especially if it involves a variance and it doesn't meet setbacks. These types of developments, they just shouldn't occur on a wild and scenic river. It's important for a community to utilize their permitting process and add clarity to ordinance standards wherever possible, so as to prevent these types of impacts. It's also incredibly important for residents to stay involved and, you know, hold their communities accountable when they approve them. All too often, a variance hearing for something like this is only attended by the applicant, but it's important for the council or board of adjustment to also be hearing from neighbors, residents who value riverway protections. Substandard structures are those that were built before 1974 that do not meet today's standards. They're basically grandfathered as is. Now, many of these older structures resemble small cabins or accessory structures in a lot of cases. These lots are far more valuable than they were 50 years ago, and there's a strong push to tear these structures down and redevelop them. There's a ton of confusion regarding these provisions because the rules that guide substandard structures are different than that of non-conforming structures, which are detailed in statute. And we see two things that folks want to do with these structures: either expand them or replace them with something bigger. So let's dig into that a little bit more. Expansions. Expansions are actually allowed in the Riverway. This is unique and far more lenient than shorelands located everywhere else in the state. But there's some stipulations. You can't increase the extent by which a structure is substandard. So if it's too close to the water, you can't build it closer. If it's too tall, you can't build it higher. Other than that, lateral and vertical expansions are allowed, but only if they're visually inconspicuous as seen from the water. This actually gives an incentive for owners of substandard structures to keep their shoreline vegetated. If you can't see the expansion because vegetation is in the way, it's allowed. If you can see it, it's not. Now, let's say you anticipate an expansion in another 10 years or so. If I was the homeowner, I would want to plant some fast-growing screening today to get ahead of it. Replacements. These restrictions are actually stricter nonconformity statute. Contrast this with expansions. Replacements are stricter. They're simply not allowed. Some folks like to assume reconstruction is allowed if they build within the existing foundation or if they rebuild slightly further away. But actually, any replacements must meet the setback and height restrictions as if it were a new structure. One other note, and I know this is a loaded slide, but it's a very important slide. Expansions and replacements are not defined by rule. We encourage all local governments to define these terms, and we have examples of how a community might define them. And we'd be happy to help any interested local governments out with sample ordinance language. I believe this is in an urban district, and it looks like it's inside of 100 feet. So let's just assume that it's a substandard structure. This house has very little screening, as is. It would be very difficult for a house like this to expand laterally or vertically in a way where it's visually inconspicuous. These property owners, they got a nice large lot and probably recognize the value in their lot is heavily dependent on its redevelopment potential. It's in their interest to heavily plant that shoreline. Now, you can grow screening fast. You know, in 5 years, if I plant like a willow or an alder, silver maple, cottonwood, in 5 years, I have screening. Those are fast growing plants. 10 years, just about any other plant is gonna adequately screen a structure. This is something that homeowners should keep in mind. It's an incentive to keep your property screened. Here's accessory structures. We have a couple of accessory structures here that are substandard. They don't meet setbacks. The rules don't provide any additional flexibility for accessory structures, sheds, garages, whatever. They're subject to the same standards as primary structures. Expansions are allowed if they're screened. Replacements are not. If torn down, it can only be built in conformance with the ordinance. So, since these are not screened, these homeowners can't alter these structures. And if they fall into disrepair, they can't rebuild them. But for now, they're grandfathered, and I'd advise these folks to keep these structures maintained. Now, earlier we shared the height limit for structures, 35 feet. Vertical expansions, just like lateral expansions, are allowed if they're visually inconspicuous as seen from the water during leaf-on conditions. Now, here's a creative way to evaluate vertical expansions. There's a recent development on the other side of the river where they floated a balloon at the building line to show whether it would be seen. And in this case, the test proved that the proposal would be seen from the water, and this decision by the local government was actually reversed in court because of these balloons. And note that even though the rules allow for vertical expansions, it's important to note that there's a number of Washington County communities whose ordinances further restrict vertical expansion specifically. Vegetation removal. On the Minnesota side of a riverway, a permit is required for any cutting within 200 feet of the water in rural districts, 100 feet from the water in urban districts, or on any steep slopes or areas within 40 feet of the bluff line. Within these areas, the allowable cutting of live trees and shrubs is very limited. Rules do allow some limited maintenance without a permit, trimming or pruning, as long as the character and density of the vegetation is preserved. Here's the standards, and they're very imperfect standards. In areas where a permit is required, a homeowner can only clear the minimum area necessary to accommodate a structure. Now, this is a provision that often gets overlooked. And when permitted, cutting is restricted to trees less than 6 inches in diameter, or diseased trees and shrubs. Any cutting activities must maintain the natural character. And this would certainly apply to the removal of any vegetation that's screening a structure. Note that the rules refer to vegetation cutting, not outright removal. So you can't even selectively cut. There's nothing in rule that allows clearing to accommodate a view. There's a couple of shortcomings to these standards. For one, the rules don't accommodate for the removal of dead trees or invasives. Additionally, there's nothing in rule that requires restoration when vegetation removal violation has occurred. We encourage every community in the Riverway to adopt standards and clarifying standards for vegetation cutting. The last couple of years, we've seen a handful of communities that have adopted some really good standards that could serve as a good template for other communities along the Riverway. And we'd be happy to point you to those examples. Vegetation removal is one of the most difficult things to enforce, but it's necessary in order to preserve the visual character of the Riverway. It just doesn't work unless the ordinance language is solid, and we'd be happy to work with any interested local governments as they develop any kind of amendments. And cutting violations, I mean, they occur all the time. This is one of the hardest things for a local government to enforce. It's time consuming and it's a low priority. Enforcement requires documentation that a violation has occurred. So here's an example of the type of a project that shouldn't be approved. This is a reconstruction. You can see that it's obviously a different house. And it appears to not meet setbacks. It's kind of squeezed between the shore and the road. So it can't meet setbacks. And it likely exceeded the impervious surface limitations. This probably would have been processed with a variance. And really, a person that wants a house like this should really find a larger lot, but that it was approved, it's fine. It is what it is. In this example, we see that the community did not require the establishment or the preservation of vegetation screening as a condition of approval. This would have required a variance. It would have been super easy for a community to require this homeowner to plant a few trees along shore. And it's just so important for a local government to utilize that permitting process. Permitting is the best opportunity for a local government to influence development for the better. And now here's a less obvious example of cutting, which probably occurred without a permit. The house is the same, but you can see that that there's been some clearing along shore between the house and the waterfront. Grading and filling. There's a permitting process for grading and filling, land disturbance activities, land alterations, whatever you want to call it. But it doesn't offer a lot of clear criteria for local governments to follow. Any change in topography requires a permit. Number one, that's the most important standard. But perhaps the most significant provision is the one that requires development to minimize disturbances. You know, if you're clearing dirt, the minimum required. You know, anytime you're moving dirt, you're disturbing everything around it. Existing vegetation is killed. There's just so many opportunities for a local government to implement higher standards as it relates to any kind of land alterations activities. If you're moving dirt, you're destroying vegetation. A community should consider incorporating some standards like that automatically trigger revegetation or restoration of new vegetation when disturbances exist. You know, that helps preserve the visual character of the riverway. If you're moving dirt, this is one of the things that you might want to look for. I suppose this is one way to clear vegetation that isn't in direct violation of the cutting standards. But in all seriousness, yeah, this is a situation where somebody's moving dirt. These trees will die. And it just speaks to the importance of, you know, permitting these types of activities. Variances. I touched on variances earlier, and it's a topic that I would love to speak more about, but I will hold off because we have a whole other training that's focused just on variances. You know, historically, Minnesota's rules required the DNR to review and certify variance decisions by local governments. But this certification piece, it was successfully challenged in 2010. And since that time, variances in the riverway are guided by the same statutory criteria as any other shoreland area in the state. You know, variances are a normal part of land use, and I mean, in shoreline situations, they're probably more common than they should be. You know, I mean, really, I wish I had more time to cover it, because when you have so much pressure to develop small lots more intensively than the local ordinance accommodates, the pressure to approve variances is inevitable. I'd encourage all zoning administrators and Board of Adjustments members to view the other resources we have on our webpage. On the left here, we have a separate training video focusing entirely on variances. And on the right, we have a variance webpage. Now within this webpage, I've circled a link to, so it says formula for variance findings. It's a template that local governments can use for considering variances and documenting findings. And this template helps to ensure variance decisions are consistent with the statutory criteria, and also ensures local decisions can withstand any kind of legal challenges. DNR notifications are a requirement, not just for variances, but for ordinance amendments too. DNR maintains management obligations for the lower riverway, and these notifications, they play a key role in DNR involvement. Those notifications for hearings to consider variances or ordinance amendments, they're required to be sent to the DNR area hydrologist at least 20 days before the hearing date. We like more time than that, but 20 days is all that's required. Final decisions must also be sent to DNR area hydrologists within 10 days of the decision. That's important for the Lower St. Croix Riverway Partnership Team in particular, as they review all variances. Ordinance amendments, they must be certified by DNR before they're considered to be effective. And we're required to provide certification or notice of non-approval within 30 days after receiving notice. It requires to be certified to be effective, or it's automatically certified if 30 days has lapsed. There's really so much more that I would love to discuss, and you know, maybe it's appropriate for a second video, you know, Riverway Management 102. But I've left my contact information, and I've also left the contact information for the 2 area hydrologists that serve the Riverway corridor. So thanks for your time. Thanks for your interest.